Today I want to do the first of 3 videos on how we deal with our motivation. It's easy to say language learning is a matter of motivation, time spent with the language, not reading grammar books, of course. But how do we keep ourselves motivated? Because inevitably there are times when we are less motivated. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that I think about, or some of the activities that I use to maintain my motivation or deal with my lagging motivation. So the first thing is, whenever we're sort of involved in a language learning activity, whether it be reading or, linking words on, say in my case, on my iPad, or listening to something in a language where I don't really understand it as well as I would like, and it seems that, there's just more and more words that I don't understand. How do I deal with that from a motivational point of view? Well, the first thing is, as I've said before, obviously you have to value what you're doing. You have to value the moment. You have to be in the moment. But paradoxically, in order to value the moment, to value what you're doing when you're listening or reading or writing or speaking in the language and not always convinced that you're getting anywhere, you have to try to enjoy it, obviously, but sometimes that's also difficult. So I think it can be helpful, and this is what I use, it can be helpful to realize that while you want to be enjoying the moment, you have to recognize that language learning is a long-term process, and that the benefits accrue cumulatively and in some ways exponentially. But there are some things we need to understand. There is a thing called Amara's law, and Amara's law says that, at least in terms of new technological development, people tend to overestimate the rate of short-term change, and they underestimate the rate at which things actually do end up changing eventually. So, we say initially, everybody's going to be driving an electric car, and for a while people get very keen, and then it seems that it's slowing down the rate of, people buying these for a variety of reasons. And then we say, it'll never really happen. But of course, eventually it ends up happening. I've seen this in business so many times. A new product, a lot of excitement at first, and then people say, then maybe that was a bust. And then in the long run, that product takes over. So this Amara's law, where we overestimate the short-term change and underestimate the long-term change. And people have isolated sort of why humans tend to react this way. Amara's law applies not only to technology, but social change or other forms of change, or even climate change. And the reason is that we tend to have what's known as a recency bias. So anything that is recent, short-term, we see it now, we are biased in favor of those things. We give them more importance, or we are more optimistic about those kinds of things. Second is short-termism. So in business, people have to satisfy their shareholders. They're looking for a short-term return. Although I must admit, in my own case, 2 major businesses that I started, one was my lumber business and the other was Link. We went through years of losing money or not having, success. So I have to admit that I am prepared. If I think something is actually important or is good or can be successful, I will tend to stay the course. But a lot of people tend to be short-term oriented. So short-term orientism is one of the reasons given to explain why this Amara's law seems to work in human activity or thought processes. The next thing is what's called exponential growth bias. People think everything grows in a linear fashion. It doesn't. Things can grow exponentially. Like I've used the metaphor in the past that language learning is like a snowball rolling down a hill. It just picks up more and more. You're not losing anything. You're picking up more and more mass in this snowball. Language learning is like that. So even though we feel we're not getting anywhere, we are in fact accumulating. We're not losing anything. So that long-term and actually exponential growth, the more things we are familiar with in the language, sounds, words, structures, the easier it is to pick up more words, more structures. I've said that accumulating words in a language, because we can access more sophisticated material if we have more words, and it's more interesting material, it's a bit like the old adage with money. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. If you have a lot of money, you can make investments, you can acquire more money. If you have a lot of words, you can read more interesting material, you notice more things, you acquire more words. So that there is an exponential aspect to this long-term growth of your language ability. Another reason is what is called temporal myopia. Myopia means we only see what's right in front of us. Just visually, it's hard for us to visualize what's going to happen, further on, longer down the road. But in order to be willing to enjoy that moment we're in, it's important not to succumb to Amara's law, but to place value on what you're doing. Another way of looking at this is this sort of, long tail marketing where theoretically, Pareto's law, 80% of your profit is going to come from 20% of your accounts. So in other words, there's a dramatic decline in frequency in many phenomena. The example was used, say, on Amazon, that the bulk of their book sales initially are popular, bestsellers, and the amount of books they sell of the sort of less popular books is not so great. However, it turns out through research that over the long haul, the total amount of book sales for some of these long tail, less popular books can amount to more than that short-term sale from, more popular items. So I haven't done this sort of market research myself, but it's another way of saying that we need to invest in the long tail, in the long term, and it's easier to do now because of our ability to access things on the internet, to stay with it on the internet, to stay with it, for example, on Link. That's where I study. Other people do different things. But if you stay with that long tail, eventually you will reap the benefits. So patience, stay with it, learn to value the moment you're in, and to value the moment you're in, you have to realize that contrary to Amara's law, you shouldn't be placing too much value on what you can do in the short term, but rather what you will be able to do in the long term. That includes, by the way, not putting too much focus on what you can say, in the beginning. Because if you spend too much time just speaking at an early stage when you have a limited vocabulary, then you aren't expanding that vocabulary, or you might be ingraining bad pronunciation or bad usage patterns. Rather, invest in that long term, invest in the listening and reading, acquire words, familiarity with structure, exposure to the language, better comprehension, and in the end, you will end up speaking better. So, there you have it. Patience, valuing the moment you're in by recognizing the long-term power of what you're doing. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.